On the night of March 9, 1945, as winter loosened its grip over the Kanto plain, Tokyo rested uneasily under a moonless sky. The hum of distant machinery, the occasional rumble of trains, and the sorrowful quiet of a city exhausted by years of war blended into a fragile silence. But there were those who sensed something unnatural in the air, an electric stillness, the kind that precedes disaster. In the wooden districts of Asakusa, Honjo, and Fukagawa, families tightened their blankets and tried to sleep, unaware that the next few hours would carve a scar into history deeper than any battle fought before. More than 1,500 miles away on the tiny island of Guam, men of the U.S. Army Air Force's 21st Bomber Command stood beside their giant aircraft, B-29 Superfortresses lined row after row under the glow of floodlights. Mechanics made final checks while crews climbed aboard, each man carrying with him a mix of resolve and dread. At 10 p.m., as engines thundered to life, Major General Curtis LeMay watched from the command post, arms folded, jaw set in stone. He had changed everything for this mission, stripping the planes of defensive guns, ordering them to fly low, and arming them with a new weapon. Clusters of M69 napalm bomblets designed not for impact, but for ignition. LeMay's strategy was brutal, calculated, and controversial even among his own men. But his directive was clear: cripple Japan's capacity to wage war by wiping out the industrial heart embedded within its cities. Captain Robert Morgan, pilot of B-29 Dauntless Dottie, felt the vibrations through his boots as the aircraft lumbered forward on the runway. The tropical night outside was black as ink. His co-pilot, Taylor, exhaled slowly, topping the altimeter. There was tension, yes, but also the grim acceptance that had settled over every crewman assigned to Operation Meeting House. Intelligence had reported Tokyo's residential and industrial zones were intertwined, with tens of thousands of small factories, family workshops, and laborers housed in tightly packed wooden dwellings. A single match, dropped in the right place, could turn entire wards into infernos. And tonight, the Americans were bringing more than a match. Back in Tokyo, Air Defense Command detected strange signals shortly after midnight. Radar operators huddled over screens, trying to interpret the faint movements. The sky was cloudy. Visibility was poor. Some believed it was merely another small reconnaissance flight. Others had grown numb after months of sporadic bomb raids. Few imagined that more than 330 B-29s were already on their way, spread across the Pacific in a massive arc. Shortly after 12:30 a.m., the first Japanese lookouts reported the distant drone of engines, a deep and unnatural rumble rolling across the sky from the southeast. Moments later, sirens erupted with a long, rising wail that pierced the sleeping city. Mothers shook their children awake. Men grabbed buckets and prepared for fire drills. In the shadowy alleys of eastern Tokyo, families hurried toward canals and open spaces, not knowing where to run or what was coming.
At 12:45 a.m., the lead B-29s flew at barely 5,000 feet, shockingly low for heavy bombers. Their bomb bays opened, releasing long canisters that spun downward before bursting in midair. These were the M47 incendiary clusters, filled with napalm thickened into a sticky gel that clung to surfaces before igniting into blinding, rage-filled fire. The first explosions blossomed like orange flowers across the city, lighting up the sky. Clouds of magnesium-white sparks floated downward as M69 bomblets burst open, scattering flaming tendrils onto rooftops and wooden structures. Within minutes, flames spread like a living organism, feeding on paper walls, tatami mats, bamboo frames, and the winter-dried timber of traditional Japanese homes. Heat rose in swirling vortices, pulling air through the narrow streets with hurricane force. Residents trying to flee found themselves pushed back by blistering winds. Many who attempted to stamp out early fires realized too late that the blaze was not isolated. It was multiplying, fusing, evolving. The second wave of B-29s arrived just as the firestorms began forming. Captain Morgan looked down through the glass bubble of his cockpit and felt his stomach tighten. What he saw below was not a city, but a sea of flames stretching to the Sumida River, twisting and surging like a beast awakened. His bombardier, Lieutenant Charles Henry, asked quietly, "My God, do we keep going?" Morgan hesitated, barely a second, but then nodded. Orders were orders, and pulling out now would only scatter the formation and increase the danger. The bomb bay doors opened once more. Down below, 15-year-old survivor Keiko Murakami remembered how the firestorm sounded, a roaring, deafening wind that tore roof tiles off houses and hurled burning debris across entire blocks. She recalled seeing the sky turn red, then white, then black with smoke so thick it smothered breath. Families clutching each other ran toward the Sumida River, believing water would save them. But the riverbanks became choked with tens of thousands of people, many of whom never made it into the water as flaming debris rained down. The river itself boiled in places as burning materials floated and drifted along the surface. A Japanese firefighting unit led by Lieutenant Yoshio Miyata struggled to push their pump cart through the chaos. Their hoses sputtered in the intense heat. Water pressure dropped as mains burst and melted. Miyata shouted orders, but communication was hopeless. His men vanished into the smoke one by one. Some suffocated, others caught beneath collapsing structures. He survived only because a blast of wind knocked him into a canal where he floated among wreckage, half-conscious, while the firestorm raged around him. Above the hellscape, the American bombers faced perils of their own. The rising heat buffeted aircraft with turbulence so violent it shook bolts loose from the fuselage. Turrets removed for weight reduction left some crews feeling exposed. Yet anti-aircraft defenses were surprisingly sparse that night. Most Japanese gun batteries were overwhelmed, unable to spot targets through thick smoke. Radio chatter crackled. "Target area completely obscured. Confirm visual from flame column." "Copy. Dropping in 30 seconds." "Christ, it's like flying over the sun." By 2:30 a.m., the largest firestorm ever recorded engulfed eastern Tokyo. Winds reached speeds over 100 miles per hour. Entire neighborhoods ignited in seconds, fire leaping from house to house faster than people could run. Some survivors described seeing whirlwinds, tornado-like pillars of flame, lifting animals, debris, even people into the air. The heat grew so intense that skin burned simply from exposure. Eyewitnesses later said birds ignited mid-flight and fell from the sky like burning fragments. Near the Kotoi Bridge, chaos reached unimaginable levels. Families struggling to cross were crushed, burned, or swept aside by the tidal wave of people behind them. Survivors remembered the sound of screams blending with the thunderous roar of fire, until the screams faded and only the roar remained. At 3 a.m., the last waves of B-29s dropped their incendiaries. The crews flew back over what was once Tokyo's most densely populated district. Instead of streets, they saw rivers of molten embers. Instead of blocks, they saw islands of glowing ash. Instead of a city, they saw a void of flames stretching beyond the horizon. On the ground, rescue workers attempted impossible tasks. Doctors and nurses at local hospitals, many operating with minimal supplies, treated burns, smoke inhalation, and injuries caused by collapsing homes. But by dawn, even medical centers were overwhelmed. One nurse later wrote that bodies were stacked like cordwood in makeshift morgues. When sunlight finally broke through the smoke-choked sky on March 10th, the scale of destruction revealed itself. Over 16 square miles of Tokyo had been reduced to cinders. Charred bodies lined roads, canals, and riverbanks. Some were found in groups, clutching one another. Others were unrecognizable, shapes preserved only as shadows etched into the ground.
Estimates vary, but historians generally agree that over 100,000 people died, making the firebombing of Tokyo the deadliest single night of warfare in human history. Deadlier than Hiroshima, deadlier than Nagasaki, deadlier than any battle fought in the war. General LeMay received reports shortly thereafter. Though many criticized his methods, including some within the U.S. military, he remained coldly pragmatic. "If we lose the war, I'll be tried as a war criminal." Yet he believed stripping Japan's cities of their industrial capacity was necessary to force surrender and end the conflict sooner. Survivors, meanwhile, faced a half-destroyed world. Keiko Murakami wandered the ruins searching for her parents, finding only remnants of her home. In her memoir, she described the ground as crunching like broken glass beneath her feet, except it wasn't glass, but burned fragments of pottery, metal, and bone. Lieutenant Yoshio Miyata crawled from the canal at dawn, covered in soot, coughing blood. He found only 2 of his men alive. The rest had vanished in the flames. The American crews returned to base exhausted, shaken by what they had witnessed. Some celebrated completing their mission. Others stared into space during debriefings, haunted by the inferno they had flown through. Captain Morgan did not sleep for more than a few hours in the following days. His bombardier, Henry, later admitted he could still smell burning wood, and worse, whenever he closed his eyes. Though the war continued for months, March 9-10 marked a turning point. It was a night that demonstrated the devastating power of fire in modern warfare and revealed the fragility of cities built from wood, paper, and hope. The firebombing also reshaped debates on military ethics, the bombing of civilians, and the limits of strategic warfare, debates that continue to this day. Yet beyond strategy, beyond politics, what remains most enduring are the human stories, the voices of those who survived and the silence of those who didn't. The mother shielding her children beneath a bridge, the firefighter who kept shouting orders long after his men were gone, the pilot who looked down and felt both duty and despair, the tens of thousands whose final moments were consumed by smoke and flame on the deadliest night the world has ever known. And when dawn rose over Tokyo on March 10, 1945, it revealed a city that had been erased, a smoldering landscape where the living searched through ashes, the dead lay in endless rows, and history itself stood still, bearing witness to the price of war.
As the smoke lifted slowly from the ruins of eastern Tokyo, the scale of devastation became clearer with each passing hour. The vast stretches of flattened districts, once alive with neighborhoods, markets, shrines, and workshops, had been reduced to indistinguishable fields of ash. In some areas, the remains of houses sat like rows of blackened skeletons, warped by the intense heat. The few surviving trees were stripped bare, their bark scorched into pale, ghostly shells. The air carried a heavy smell, burning wood mixed with something far more human, a scent that many survivors said never left them for the rest of their lives. In the days following the raid, Japanese authorities and emergency teams mobilized, though they were themselves battered by the scale of the destruction. Army units, civil defense groups, and volunteers from unaffected areas of Tokyo struggled to move through the rubble. They set up aid stations where crowds of displaced residents sat quietly, covered in soot, many still in shock. Some stared blankly at the ground. Others asked desperately for news of missing relatives, though few answers could be given. Entire families had vanished in the flamestorm. In one surviving neighborhood on the western side of the city, a Buddhist monk named Reverend Hideo Mori organized a small relief center at his temple, which had miraculously escaped destruction.
He and a handful of volunteers handed out rice balls, water, and blankets to those who had fled the eastern districts during the night. Mori later wrote in his diary that the eyes of the survivors held no tears, only a hollow, empty stillness, as though the soul itself had burned away and left only the shell of a person behind. Among the survivors was a young boy named Satoru Takayama, who had been separated from his mother during the frantic escape toward the Sumida River. Burned on his arms and legs, he wandered the streets calling her name until he reached Mori's temple several days later. Volunteers cared for him, but his mother was never found. Like tens of thousands of others, she had been lost in the firestorm, her final moments known only to the inferno that consumed her. Meanwhile, in the offices of Japan's military high command, the mood was a mixture of anger, disbelief, and grim acceptance. Senior officers were briefed on the scale of the destruction. More than 260,000 buildings lost, countless small factories wiped out, and communication lines in several key wards severed. Lieutenant General Seishiro Itagaki, one of the commanders involved in Tokyo's defense, slammed his fist on the table during the first meeting after the raid. How, he demanded, could one city, our capital, be brought to this state in a single night? Yet no one in the room had an answer. The raid had shattered assumptions about Japan's air defenses and exposed how vulnerable the densely packed wooden districts were to incendiary tactics. New strategies were proposed: more night patrols, relocating factories, creating fire breaks by demolishing rows of houses, and improving the radar network. But even as these ideas were discussed, a grim reality settled over the room. There was neither the time nor the resources to fully implement them. Japan was already stretched thin on multiple fronts, its navy crippled, its supply lines collapsing, and the American B-29s showed no signs of slowing down. On the American side, the aftershock of Operation Meeting House reverberated through the crews and command staff. While official reports described the mission as a significant success, privately many aviators struggled to reconcile the magnitude of destruction they had witnessed. During a debriefing on Guam, Lieutenant James Taylor sat silently while the commanding officer praised the accuracy of the incendiary patterns. Taylor later wrote to his wife that even though he understood the attack was meant to shorten the war, he could not shake the image of Tokyo glowing like a furnace, a place where no living thing could survive.
General Curtis LeMay, however, viewed the operation with cold strategic logic. He emphasized to Washington that Japan's war production was intertwined with its civilian population. Many small manufacturers, including families working from their own homes, produced essential war components, aircraft parts, uniforms, tools, and munitions. Destroying these districts, therefore, was not just aerial terror, it was a way to break Japan's ability to sustain the war. When questioned about civilian casualties, LeMay responded that ending the war quickly would save more lives in the long term, including American soldiers who would otherwise die in a prolonged invasion. Yet not all American leaders agreed. Some within the Roosevelt administration felt uneasy. In a private discussion in Washington, Secretary of War Henry Stimson raised concerns that the scale of civilian deaths might damage post-war relations and stain America's moral standing. He had already objected to bombing Kyoto for similar reasons. But in the end, strategic necessity outweighed moral hesitation, and the bombing campaign continued. Over the next few weeks, Tokyo remained shrouded in a haze from smoldering ruins. Survivors picked through debris, searching for remnants of their former lives. Pots fused by heat, steel tools softened into warped shapes, family altars turned to dust, and keepsake photographs burned beyond recognition. The metropolis that once bustled with life had become a silent wasteland through which people walked like ghosts. Yet, even in tragedy,
human resilience emerged. Markets sprang up along surviving streets. Families built makeshift shelters from scrap wood and tin. Volunteers from rural areas arrived with food shipments. Shinto and Buddhist priests performed mass memorial rites, their chants rising above the ruins like prayers for the lost. Still, many survivors found themselves haunted in ways no ritual could ease. Keiko Murakami, who had escaped the inferno by finding shelter in a canal, suffered from severe nightmares in the weeks that followed. She recalled hearing the roar of the fire in her sleep, feeling heat on her skin, and seeing the faces of neighbors who had not made it. Later in life, she wrote that the firebombing had left not only scars on the city, but on the heart. Scars that do not fade even when decades pass. As April and May arrived, the United States continued its campaign. Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe were heavily firebombed, leaving millions more homeless. Tokyo itself was struck repeatedly, until by late summer, more than half the city had been destroyed. The cumulative effect was catastrophic. Japan's urban infrastructure collapsed, its economy ground to a halt, and its population faced starvation. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. For the first time in centuries, the Japanese people saw their homeland burned and shattered on a scale unimaginable. The firebombing did what no foreign enemy had done in over 1,000 years. It brought war into the heart of Japan's capital. In the American camps on Guam, crewmen prepared for each mission with increasing weariness. Captain Robert Morgan felt the burden of command growing heavier. Though he rarely spoke of it, he carried guilt from that night over Tokyo. Some men drank. Others withdrew into themselves. A few requested transfers, though few were granted. The war machine demanded momentum, and none were allowed to step aside. By July 1945, Tokyo lay in ruins. Photographs taken by reconnaissance planes showed a patchwork of blackened districts where thriving communities once stood. Ambassador Naotake Sato, who had been stationed in Moscow during the war, later described his reaction upon seeing these images. It was as though a part of our nation's soul had burned away, and in its place remained only emptiness. Yet, even as the city lay broken, life continued. People cooked rice over makeshift stoves fashioned from bricks. Children played in bomb craters. Street vendors returned, selling whatever they could salvage. There was suffering, yes, but also determination. The firebombing of Tokyo would soon be overshadowed in world memory by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki just months later. But those who lived through March 9th to 10th never forgot the inferno that consumed their city. Many historians argue that Operation Meeting House, more than any other single event, demonstrated the destructive potential of modern warfare before the atomic age arrived. In the decades after the war, survivors gathered annually to remember the night the sky turned red. Memorials were built, poems written, testimonies recorded. And in every telling, the same questions lingered. Could it have been justified? Did such destruction truly hasten peace? Could the war have ended differently? There were no easy answers then, and there are no easy answers now. What remains undeniable is the human cost. The lives lost, the families shattered, the city burned to embers. The firebombing of Tokyo endures not only as a historical fact, but as a warning etched in flame that war, once unleashed, grows beyond control, consuming both the guilty and the innocent, leaving behind ash where once there was life. And on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, Tokyo became the place where that truth burned brighter and deadlier than anywhere else in human history.